Thank you very much. I'd like to welcome everybody now to the closing rally of Socialism 2018. My name's Paula Mitchell. I'm the Secretary of the Socialist Party in London, and I'm chairing this final rally. Before we get started, I think it is worth saying that today, of course, we're meeting on a day which many other people in the country are also marking because it is 100 years since the end of the First World War. And of course, as socialists, as class fighters, then we honour the lives of all working men and women who died in that war and in all the terrible conflicts that have taken place across the world since. And I think we would also say that there is no better way, really, to remember and to commemorate those lives lost by committing ourselves to fighting to change this world that is full of such brutality, injustice and war. And that is why we have spent the weekend discussing and debating socialist ideas so that we can bring an end to war and build a socialist society instead. And I think in that endeavour, it has been a fantastic weekend. I'm sure that I hope that everyone has really enjoyed it as much as I have. It's been an absolute privilege to take part with people from all over the country in the really vibrant and varied discussions that have taken place this weekend. Many people here are here for the first time, taking your first steps, finding out about socialist ideas. Of course, many people here are also veterans of socialism events, but everybody here, I think, has contributed fantastically to this weekend, and everybody here has a crucial role to play in action, but also in the discussion and the debate that has taken place about socialist ideas, about working class history, about what's happening in the world today, and about what needs to be done. And a key aspect of what needs to be done is political resistance to austerity, the programme that is needed and the organisation to achieve it, a political voice for the mass of working class and young people. And that is the theme of this final rally. We're meeting now more than 3 years since Jeremy Corbyn won the leadership of the Labour Party and raised the possibility of changing the Labour Party from a Blairite, pro-austerity, pro-capitalist party and achieving a mass anti-austerity socialist party. Raised that possibility, and it has raised hopes. It has raised expectations, but of course also a whole number of new questions and challenges. Now, our speakers tonight are going to discuss various aspects of that, and our first speaker at the rally is Theo Sharif, who is the National Chair of Socialist Students, which is a national campaigning socialist organisation on campuses all over the country. And we think it's important to start with this because, of course, amongst all the many people who were inspired by Corbyn's programme, young people in particular were inspired to get active, to go to rallies, to take part in discussion and debate, and were excited at the prospect of a change from years of attacks, excited at the prospect of being able to fight for a better future. So I'd like you to welcome, as our first speaker, Theo.
Well, comrades, last year we gathered in this very same hall just 6 months after the 2017 general election. And spotting their opportunity to keep up the offensive after punishing the Tories at the ballot box, workers across the country followed through with months of resistance, striking bin workers in Birmingham, Bart's health workers in London, and British Airways cabin crew, for example, were all determined to not let the Tories have the last say after narrowly scraping through the general election. Students and young workers took similar inspiration from an election which at times resembled more of a movement. Thousands of us amassed at rallies around the country to hear Corbyn speak, and we flooded polling booths to vote for the programme that he put forward. A £10 an hour minimum wage, a mass programme of council house building to end a generation-defining housing crisis, scrapping tuition fees, and the nationalisation of railways and the energy companies. But if June 2017 represented a moment of political awakening for thousands of students and young workers, then what has the subsequent year represented? The Tories have been sent into a downward spiral of political crisis ever since the June election. We're witnessing the unravelling of a party which has been violently shaken by scandal and mass outrage. Of course, from Theresa May's hostile environment to universal credit to the emergence of an open civil war which has totally consumed the top ranks of the Tory leadership over the question of Brexit. But amidst this chaos, where for students has the official call to action been to mobilise in the streets to kick out the Tories? This will be the question sitting centre stage in the minds of all those people who voted for Jeremy Corbyn 18 months ago. And if it's young people who face the sharp edge of the boss's attacks, then we're the most desperate, but simultaneously the most impatient for Corbyn's anti-austerity programme. A call by Corbyn for young people to flood the streets, to fight for free education, to fight for affordable housing, for stable jobs on a £10 an hour minimum wage could all radically transform the situation and spell the end of the Tory government. Because as revolutionaries, but also as Marxists, we aren't anxious to hide from the reality of the situation, but instead we want to confront it head on. And in doing so, we strive to provide all the answers necessary to take our movement forward with the utmost faith in the ability of the working class and young people to fight back and win. Lenin, whose leadership was central to the success of the Socialist Revolution in Russia in October 1917, once wrote, "Is it not natural that the youth should predominate in our party, the Revolutionary Party? We are the party of the future, and the future belongs to the youth. We are a party of innovators, and it is always the youth that most eagerly follows the innovators. Against the old rottenness, the youth is always the first to undertake a self-sacrificing struggle. And despite all the cowardice demonstrated by the right-wing, Blairite-dominated leadership of the student movement, in particular the National Union of Students, we've no reason to doubt the lengths that students and young people are willing to go to wage that same self-sacrificing struggle identified by Lenin in 1917. Since we gathered in this hall last November, thousands of students all across the country, often led by socialist students, mobilised in remarkable solidarity actions to support striking university staff defending their pensions. And of course, on the 4th of October, young workers from McDonald's, Wetherspoons, TGI Fridays, and Uber Eats made history when they coordinated action to stand up to some of the most ruthless and exploitative bosses in the hospitality industry. The inspiring determination showed by students and workers in these struggles is an echo of the colossal political earthquake which they demonstrated at last year's general election. And as that memory of that moment, we came within inches of winning a Corbyn-led government, remains an inspiration to thousands of us, it remains a spectre in the minds of the Tory government. And Theresa May, people will have seen this in her desperation to claw back a shred of legitimacy in the eyes of the millions of people whose lives have been ruined by years of brutal Tory cuts, announced at the Tory party conference in September that austerity is over, promising all of us better days ahead. But for the thousands of young low-paid workers employed on zero-hours contracts, or the millions of students graduating from university with tens of thousands of pounds of worth of debt, or the estimated 1 million families stuck on housing waiting lists up and down the country, this is a message which undoubtedly will ring completely hollow. Even the leader of a Tory council in Walsall let the truth slip when he admitted, "Never ever believe what you hear from central government. Austerity is not over." Because we know that the only way with certainty that austerity can be defeated is through the building of mass mobilizations of workers and of students to put an end to this rapidly decaying government. 50 years ago in France, students reached out to the mighty forces of the French working class who built a movement which threatened the future existence of capitalism itself, not only within France, but across the whole of Europe. The Socialist Party is striving to build a party worthy of that legacy. A leadership that, yes, is determined to go to the very end in the fight to turn all of the promises in Corbyn's programme into a reality. But as Peter outlined in the rally yesterday, more than that also. And we need in socialist students a leadership which carries on its shoulders all of the lessons of history, with a clear programme to unite students and workers in a common struggle for the socialist transformation on society. And I'll finish on this point. The far right all across the world are the hallmark signs of a system passing through the stages of decay. Those who stand to gain the most from consigning such a rotten system to history are the youth and students sat in this hall today, but also the international working class. We believe that the battles which we are seeing waged today are only the prelude of what is to come. A life and death struggle not only against capitalist-driven austerity, but against capitalism itself. Until that moment arrives, however, socialist students will be building its forces on the campuses, but also in the schools, in the colleges, in preparation for that task. Please join us in our goal to build a revolutionary force of students and workers who will defeat the Tories and consign capitalism to history in Britain and across the globe forever.
That's fantastic, Theo. Thank you very much. Now, at every stage in the struggle against austerity, and since Corbyn's election, we've discussed and put forward what we think is necessary. That has been in terms of young people, as Theo has just outlined, in terms of what programme to fight for, what needs to be done to change the Labour Party, what to do at elections, and also what is the role of trade unions in this new situation. A situation of enormous Tory attacks, but also now the possibility of a Jeremy Corbyn-led government. Now, our next speaker is Marion Lloyd, who is currently on the National Executive Committee of the Civil Service Union, the PCS, and is standing to win the Left Unity nomination for President in the PCS elections, and of course is also supporting Chris Boff for Assistant General Secretary. Marion.
Well, comrades, I'm enormously proud and privileged to be standing for the Left Unity nomination for President of PCS, together with my comrade, Chris Boff. Because not only are we standing on a socialist programme, and not only are we being supported by the Socialist Party, but we have got the support of the best activists right across our trade union. This year marks my 40th year of activity since I joined the civil service. At 16, I was victimised by the employer who was already cottoned on that I was a stalwart for Marxist ideas and socialism inside the civil service. Victimised after finding a copy of the militant newspaper in my handbag. God knows what they were really looking for. But aided and abetted by one of the most vicious right-wing trade union leaderships in the whole of the trade union leadership, I had a choice. Do I run? Do I pack up and go home? Or do I carry on fighting for socialist ideas, not just in CPSA as it was then, but in society? And I chose to stand and fight. And we fight for socialist ideas, to build the left, to build the union, to organise, educate and agitate, not just to win concessions from the employer, but also to raise the ideas of socialism, to build consciousness among members, young and old alike. But what sustained me and others inside the trade union movement and CPSA and PCS in particular. It's the ideas of Marxism, the ideas of the militant, the ideas of the Socialist Party. I learnt and caucused and fought with some of our most inspirational comrades in the whole of our organisation. Kevin Roddy, John Macready, Terry Adams, Chris Boff, Danny Williamson, absolute stalwarts to our movement. And these are the ideas that will sustain us in the next period, in the battle that is to come, the battle that we are in now, the here and the now. And we've got a huge amount at stake inside PCS as we enter the Left Unity election period. Those who have broken with us, let's be in no doubt, those who have broken with us want to defeat the ideas of Marxism. They want to take all our positions off us at the NEC, the National Executive, and inside Left Unity itself. They want to stop the ideas of Marxism being discussed and debated inside the ranks of our movement. They want to stop the ideas and the positions that we hold because they are scared and frightened of the alternative that we put forward, the correct analysis and the correct political position. And they dress it all up as a simple personality that Mark can't get on with Chris. What an absolute nonsense. We're not in a school playground. We are in absolute serious discussion and debate. I have not seen the likes of the character assassination, the lies and distortion since I was working against the most vicious right-wing leadership such as Barry Reamsbottom and Marion Chambers. This is the depths to which these people have absolutely stooped on. But unlike them, we have a clear programme, we have a clear strategy based on socialist ideas and moving workers into struggle. This is about lay control or bureaucracy. Is it about democratic lay control of our union or strengthening the bureaucracy? These people have capitulated to reformism and someone said this morning, parliamentary cretinism. And let's look at the programme that we are standing on. On pay, they oppose our programme to defeat the pay cap. Why wouldn't we? Link up the attacks on the pay cap with pay, with jobs, with office closures, with protecting services and all those issues that concretely members want to move into struggle about. They are showing a complete lack of confidence in our members' preparedness to fight. But we know different, as demonstrated in the recent ballot in the justice sector, where one of the most disorganised areas of our union smashed through the cap to 74% turnout in terms of defending their pay and their conditions. On democracy, unlike the people who want to centralise bureaucratic control, we stand for increased democratic lay control, extending the election of full-time officers and ensuring that all employers of the union are accountable to the elected leaderships inside the union itself. On equality, it'll take far more than positive discrimination to tackle the deep discriminatory practices inside the civil service, inside our HR policies, and inside our offices. Nice articles talking about reserved seats, 50-50, etc., are not going to solve the deep-rooted equality issues that we've got inside our union. And we should follow the inspirational struggle of the Glasgow women who have shown what needs to be done in order to deal with inequalities. But of course, at the heart of all this is the relationship with the Labour Party. Critical to this is the difference between those inside our union, those who have broken with us, who believe that all we need to do is elect a Jeremy Corbyn government on an anti-austerity programme, and that's the end of the struggle. But of course, we know differently. Yes, we want to see Jeremy Corbyn and his programme elected to central government. Of course, we want him to fulfil all the promises he's given us within 100 days. But anyone who thinks that without a struggle on the streets, a struggle amongst members of our class to ensure that he implements his promises and in fact goes that step further, are living on another planet. And the debate that we are involved in is crucial, not just to the future of PCS, but to the future of our class and the class struggle in the context of a Corbyn Labour government. We believe fundamentally, unlike the people who are trying to remove us, who believe that the election of Corbyn is the end of history, we believe that it is the beginning of history. If you're not part of our struggle, join with us. Join with us in making history. Let's get Chris re-elected into the position that we deserve and we fought for. But more than that, we must lay and increase the foundation to ensure that people are involved, raise their consciousness, and so lay the basis for a socialist transformation of society. Thank you.
Well, I'll vote for Marion. What a fantastic president she's going to make, we hope, of the PCS. But of course, we have to fight, and we all have to do that. And so if you haven't got these leaflets, they're here for Chris, for Marion, for the whole slate in the struggle which is currently taking place in Left Unity to win the Left Unity nominations. Then please make sure you take back supplies for your region. Now, our next speaker has come from Ireland, so we're very pleased that he's managed to make it here today. Paul Murphy is a Socialist MP or TD in the Irish Parliament. And he's rushing up here. Let me just say very quickly then that our sister party, the Socialist Party in Ireland, and our 3 elected MPs or TDs have played a central role in a series of mass struggles and tremendous victories in Ireland against water charges, against state repression in the Jobestown trial, and in the struggle for abortion rights. And we're very, very privileged to be able to have Paul, who has played a leading role in all of those struggles, who's going to be able to elaborate further on the role of a socialist representative.
Thanks a lot. Sorry, I thought my introduction was done there and then I kept going. I want to start with a few lines from a poem. If you could hear at every jolt the blood come gurgling from the froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cud, of vile, incurable sores on innocent tongues, my friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory, the old lie, dulce et decorum est, pro patria moria. For those who don't know, it's a picture from Wilfred Owen's of the horrific destruction and devastation and killing of World War I. And the final line said, or should be said with bitter anger, in Latin or in English, that it is sweet and honourable to die for your country. And it is an appropriate time to remind ourselves of the incredible capacity of the capitalist and imperialist system for that sort of barbaric destruction. Destruction which is utterly senseless from the point of view of the great majority in our world. And 100 years on, unfortunately, that capacity, with all the technological advances, misapplied and in the wrong hands, in the hands of the profiteers, is multiplied many times over. And I thought that was brought home very graphically last week in a report some of you might have seen from the World Wildlife Fund, which said that since 1970, 60% of the world's creatures have been made extinct. That's the equivalent, if that was humanity, of every single person in North America, in Latin America, in Africa, in Europe, and in China being taken off the face of the earth. The scientists who interpreted the report or came up with the report said that what we're facing is the 6th mass extinction event on the Earth. And it's the first extinction event caused by a species, caused by humanity. And of course that's true, but it's an abstraction to call it humanity. It's not just humanity. It's not me and you and everybody here, ordinary people, who make the decisions about how our society is run, who make the decisions to cut down palm trees, who make the decisions to wrap bananas in plastic, who make the decisions to build our communities on the basis of private car usage. It's human society organized on the basis of profit, organized on the basis of the private ownership of the sources of wealth, of the means of production. It's human society organized on the basis of capitalism. And the conclusion was that we are the first generation to know we are destroying the planet and the last one that can do anything about it. And what that brought echoes of for me was what Engels wrote and then popularized by Rosa Luxemburg, the idea of socialism or barbarism. That it's not some truism, it's not an abstract truth, it's an urgent call for action. Because that descent to barbarism that capitalism is engaged in is obviously embodied, and we can see it in the person of Donald Trump, in Bolsonaro, in Brazil, in Duterte, in the Philippines. And recently in Ireland, in our own presidential election, which is largely a figurehead position, we had a warning of how that populist right can grow at home too, where because of the very restrictive rules of the election, there's no left candidate, there's no left anti-establishment voice in the race. The entire establishment rode behind the incumbent Michael D. Higgins, who was a former Labour left, but who was sold out many years ago, but still uses rhetoric about social justice and has a certain progressive veneer for a section of the population. And he walked away with the election. I mean, he got 56% of the vote. But the main story of the election was the emergence of our own mini pale reflection of Donald Trump, a guy called Peter Casey. And the parallels are striking. He's deeply inarticulate. He is a multi-millionaire. He gives out about, spongers, but he doesn't pay any tax. And he's a TV presenter who made his name in a TV show about entrepreneurship like The Apprentice. But he went from 1% in the opinion polls up to 23% in the final vote. And he did it on the basis of engaging in racist, anti-traveller rhetoric, which got an echo principally from the more backward sections of society, but also from a section of working class people who were alienated from the establishment. And it's a very sharp illustration for the topic we're discussing today, about the need for a socialist political opposition to austerity, for the need for the socialist left to be present, to harness the anger, to harness the alienation, and to direct it upwards against the capitalist class who are responsible for the miseries our class faces, instead of allowing it to be diverted and directed downwards at other sections of the oppressed. And obviously the primary location of that struggle is in the workplaces, is in the communities, is in the colleges, and is on the streets. But elections, positions in council, positions in parliament, can be a very important auxiliary to those struggles, as a powerful platform for the movements of our class, as I think we have demonstrated in Ireland over the last whole number of years. We used, for example, an election, a by-election, and then a victory in the by-election and a position in Parliament to popularise and to agitate for the mass non-payment of water charges, which succeeded in getting 73% of people to refuse to pay and defeated that hated tax. We also used it to popularise and raise awareness about the accessibility of the abortion pill and to undermine in practice the repressive anti-abortion legislation that we had in Ireland, and to link that to the need for a mass movement, to fight for a referendum, and then ultimately to win that referendum again successfully. To act as a megaphone, to amplify the demands of workers who we represent, who we speak out for in the Parliament. Recently, Lloyd's workers, who are overwhelmingly female, precarious workers, a strike against precarity, and currently the Glendimplex strike happening in the north. But also to put forward our socialist programme, to popularise our socialist programme, a socialist analysis. I had the opportunity to do that on Thursday with Mario Draghi, who is the head of the European Central Bank, was before the Finance Committee. And I was able to use that platform to challenge him on the role of the European Central Bank in representing the interests of the big bankers, of forcing the debts of those big bankers onto working class people right across the continent of Europe, and the undemocratic role of the European Central Bank in pushing those diktats of austerity, in removing governments, as part of the model of authoritarian neoliberalism that makes up the European Union. He didn't like it, evidently, and that's why you had a headline in the Financial Times which referred to it as a fiery exchange. But how we do that in Ireland is not invented by us. It's an attempt to apply the methods of the Bolsheviks in the Tsarist Duma, obviously in very different times, but also of our comrades of the militant MPs in Britain in different but less different times. And it underlines the essential nature of our international. Marxism is based on the distillation of the experience of hundreds of years of class struggle. And the more of those experiences, the more of those struggles that we can be close to, that we can learn from, the sharper not only our program is, which is essential, but also our strategy and our tactics for that struggle. And all of our struggles build on our comrades' struggles across the international. Our victory against the water charges was built upon the experience of your defeat of the poll tax, centrally the tactic of mass non-payment. We're now exploring the idea of an Amazon tax, like the comrades in Seattle, because Amazon have moved in down the road from where I live, and they'll regret that. Or the experience of the Liverpool struggle, where we recently had the privilege of having Tony Mulhern speak to us over Skype at our local branch in preparation for our local elections, about using the councils as a focal point for a struggle, for mobilisation, for resistance against austerity. Just to finish up, it's sometimes said now by those who are called capitalist realists, or described as capitalist realists, that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism. And so that's the equation of socialism or barbarism, with socialism removed as an option. It's a fatalistic view, which is understandable for many people if you don't appreciate the power that working class people have to bring about the end of capitalism and to create a socialist world. And so just to finish, I'd ask people to think about what brought World War I to an end. It wasn't enlightened leaders convinced of the need for peace. It was working class people in extremely difficult circumstances making revolutions. It was the Russian Revolution in October 1917, shining a beacon of inspiration right across the world. It was the revolutionary movements right across Europe which followed that. And above all, it was the German Revolution, which overthrew the Kaiser and which would have created a German Soviet Republic if it wasn't for the betrayal of social democracy. Without that betrayal, or the different strategy pursued by the Communist Party in the years that followed, we would be living in a very, very different world today. But the power of the working class was there for all to see 100 years ago, and it's there for all to see today. Our job is not just to imagine the end of capitalism, it's to help others imagine it in action and in program, and then to make it happen in our lifetimes with the power of the working class allied to a revolutionary socialist program. Thank you.
very much, Paul. Our next speaker is Dave Nellist, who is a former Labour MP, expelled for being too socialist, then a Socialist Party councillor and national chair of TUSC, the Trade Unionist and Socialist Coalition, an electoral alliance for the last number of years which has included the Socialist Party and the RMT Transport Union, and which has stood candidates against pro-austerity politicians since 2010. Dave's now going to speak about what has been achieved with TUSC over all those years, and also the stage that we have now reached. Dave.
2 weeks ago, Philip Hammond, the Tory Chancellor, introduced a budget promising the beginning of the end of the era of austerity. Now, I'm not quite sure whether he was consciously evoking Churchill's El Alamein speech, which actually was 76 years ago yesterday, about this not being the end or even the beginning of the end or perhaps the end of the beginning. I can't do the accent, but you get the point. The point is that it's not. The Institute of Fiscal Studies a few weeks ago reckoned that the British economy is 16% or £300 billion smaller than it would have been without the recession. For workers, it's been the worst decade for wages since Peterloo at the end of the Napoleonic Wars 200 years ago. The Trussell Trust, which organises over 400 food banks across the country, sees 650,000 people a year, 13% higher than 12 months ago. Millions fear the introduction of universal credit, a fear that could turn to anger, according to John Major and Gordon Brown. And in areas where universal credit has already been brought in, there's been a 52% rise in use of food banks. As a consequence of austerity, inadequate care systems, cuts to social services, growth in life expectancy has stalled, and in some areas of the country has begun to fall. So I'll believe that an era of austerity is coming to an end, not when a Tory Chancellor announces £1.5 billion of cuts in business rates to shops, but when there are no longer people sleeping rough in every second and third shop doorway in the towns and cities of this country. Exactly 5 years ago today, David Cameron made a speech in the Mansion House where he said that public spending cuts were necessary not as a temporary austerity, but to permanently slim down public services and to shrink the state. But not all welfare has been cut. The Tories claim that welfare payments amount to about £90 billion a year. But that's less than the £96 billion a year they pay out in corporate welfare, in low corporation taxes, other tax breaks to preserve and boost the profits of big business. The Chancellor may, in that speech, have announced an end to PFI deals when there were no more in the pipeline anyway, but it means little for the £10 billion a year that's still wasted on the 800 PFI deals that Labour and Tory governments have brought in over the last 25 years, many of which have been bought up by hedge funds and relocated to tax havens. They should all be renationalised. Hammond announced some ring-fenced one-offs of inadequate amounts for adult social care, high streets, potholes and education's little extras, as if £10,000 for primary school would get you more than about half a teaching assistant. But the Chancellor announced nothing to deal with the £6 billion a year funding gap faced by local councils over the next 2 years. One council, Northamptonshire County Council, effectively declared itself bankrupt earlier this year, and others could follow in East Sussex, Norfolk, Lancashire, Surrey and even Birmingham. But councils don't need to slash jobs and essential local services. They don't need to close libraries. They don't need to close nurseries, youth clubs and community centres. Labour councils alone and there are 125 of them across Britain, control combined budgets of almost £79 billion. They hold about £14 billion of various reserves. Their combined spending power is greater than the GDP of 9 EU countries or the state budgets of 16. They're not an inconsequential political or economic force. If the political will was there, no Labour council needs meekly to make Hammond's cuts. They could use reserves and borrowing powers to generate resources for no cuts budgets. Then they could launch a coordinated campaign to force the Tory government to increase funding to local councils to match local communities' needs. Now, earlier this year, the Guardian's Polly Toynbee reckoned if the Tory-controlled local government association massed the ranks of their councils to oppose the cuts, their political power would be unstoppable. And we agree with Polly. Even more so for Labour councils. Now, seeing the need for a genuine anti-austerity party, one in action as well as one in words, led Bob Crow, the late General Secretary of the Transport Union, the RMT, to work with Socialists, particularly the Socialist Party, to set up Tusk at the beginning of 2010. Interestingly, what prefaced the actual setting up of Tusk was a conference hosted by the RMT 2 months earlier, where the speakers taking part in a discussion about what to do about the crisis of working class political representation, alongside myself, was Bob Crow, was Joe Higgins, Paul's predecessor as the Socialist Party of Ireland's MEP, the FBU General Secretary, Matt Rack, and one Jeremy Corbyn. It's well worth taking a long look at the Tusk website, where there's a very useful history of the conferences, meetings, and campaigns that Tusk subsequently organised. It's an impressive list. Over those 8 years, Tusk had been a model of how an inclusive coalition of working class organisations could work together. Trade unionists, community campaigners, socialists from different parties and from none have stood against pro-austerity establishment politicians under a common banner and an agreed platform of core policies. Tusk has a tremendous record over those 8 years. Around 2,500 candidates stood on behalf of Tusk, polling around 375,000 votes between them. There was a tremendous intervention in the 2015 elections, in the general election where we stood 135 parliamentary candidates, and in the council elections where over 600 local council candidates were stood. We were the 6th biggest party in those elections, though given the paucity of media coverage, you'd be forgiven for not necessarily knowing that. But shortly after that election, Jeremy was elected as Labour's leader. And in the following general election of 2017, Tusk's steering committee agreed not to stand any parliamentary candidates, but instead to work all out to try and get Jeremy Corbyn into number 10 Downing Street. Now, that would still be the case if the current splits and arguments within the Tory party resulted in a snap general election now. All the component parts of Tusk remain firmly committed to continuing the fight against austerity policies and the politicians from whichever party implement them. But, unfortunately, there is no longer unanimous agreement on the steering committee as to whether those campaigns should continue to extend to challenging right-wing Labour councillors at the ballot box in next May's local elections. Tusk will continue to publish detailed information on council reserves, and will shortly start work on a survey across England and Wales, council by council, of budget cuts planned for next year. Tusk will continue to publish guidance material on how to prepare no-cuts people's budgets based on the needs of local communities. But the Tusk National Steering Committee, which met last Wednesday, heard from the lay representatives of the RMT that the union were unable to commit to authorising Tusk candidates in next year's elections in the way it had in the past. It remains the case, however, that a substantial majority of Labour councillors, particularly on Labour-led authorities, hold to the politics of Tony Blair, of a pro-market austerity being an unfortunate necessity, of there being no alternative. They're part not of the break with that Blairite past which Jeremy Corbyn represents, but a continuation of it. Later this month, every council in the country will publish a pre-budget report prior to around 6 weeks or so of consultation on the job services and essential support they intend to cut from next April. I think every branch should get a copy of their local report and discuss it as part of preparing for next year's elections. Election campaigns are not won based on 3 weeks' work in April. Anti-austerity votes gained on Thursday, May the 2nd, 2019, will be based on a record of campaigning and activity. And where that record doesn't already exist, it needs months of campaigning to make even the smallest dent in the idea that pro-austerity councillors are the only ideas worth listening to. So if we, the Socialist Party, are not prepared to give right-wing Blairite councillors free run next May, and we're not, we have to start now using our own electoral logo, Socialist Alternative, as the banner under which to fight. We respect the RMT's decision, but the future of essential local services and the working class families who rely on them are too important to let thousands of more jobs be lost, wages and conditions of council workers to deteriorate, and the threat to libraries, nurseries, youth clubs and community centres to go unchallenged. So to finish, Philip Hammond is no Churchill. Margaret Thatcher, nearly, Theresa May is no Margaret Thatcher. I was doing so well, wasn't I? In 1983, the year I was first elected to Parliament, Margaret Thatcher had a majority of 144. Yet a determined campaign in the mid-1980s by Liverpool City Council, politically inspired by the militant forerunner of today's Socialist Party, beat Thatcher and the Tories and won millions of pounds of extra funding sufficient to build thousands of new council houses and open schools, sports centres and parks. If Labour councillors today had the spirit of Liverpool and Lambeth, the spirit of Claycross and Poplar, if Jeremy and John McDonnell were to demand that local Labour councils use their resources and powers to implement no-cuts budgets in exchange for a mass campaign of trade unionists and working class communities to demand the government fully funds the needs of local communities, then this weak Tory government, not with a majority of 144, but with a shaky majority of 13, which may not even last the next 7 days, could be forced into an early general election. And Jeremy's radical agenda of a £10 an hour minimum wage, an end to tuition fees, a crash house building programme, public ownership of rail, of post, of water and of energy. That could take the first steps to begin the rejection of the last decade of austerity and the years of pro-market economics which preceded it. A fighting stance by Labour councillors and councils, a determined lead from the top of Labour, coordinated resistance from the trade union movement could increase the pressure for the Tory government to go. The beginning of the end of austerity could be in sight, but councillors who are not prepared to fight should make way for Socialist Alternative candidates who will. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, Dave. I see that some people are perhaps having to go and get trains and so on in order to go home. Before you do, you might want to hear an announcement that I'm about to make. We had an appeal yesterday in the rally yesterday evening, and when Sarah Rack made that appeal, she explained that, of course, we already know that this year, and just in the last few months, that members and supporters of the Socialist Party had already made enormous financial sacrifices, in particular to our building fund appeal, and had already donated more than £150,000 just in the last few months towards that building fund appeal. I expect Sarah made the fighting fund appeal with a small degree of trepidation, but I can announce now that the result of that appeal is an absolutely tremendous £35,020. fantastic testament, I think, to the determination of the members and supporters of this party to fight to change the world. But I will also say, of course, that some of you may not have been here yesterday or may have taken Sarah's advice and decided not to have that extra pint last night or not quite so many cakes today and may have a little bit extra in your pockets. And if you do, then there are going to be buckets on the doors when you leave if you didn't have the opportunity to make that contribution last night. I will also just say at this point on the question of money, in addition to all of that, the bookshop has also sold £2,500 worth of books as well, which is also extremely good. But now we're going to move on to the final speaker of this closing rally of Socialism 2018. Hannah Sell is the Deputy General Secretary of the Socialist Party. To many of her credits, one of them is that she writes a lot of articles and has written a lot of material helping to develop the ideas and the practice of the Socialist Party, in Socialism Today and so on, ideas which we obviously collectively discuss and debate and produce, which is what we've been doing this weekend. But I think it's going to be a really good finish to the weekend to have Hannah to draw together the themes of this rally and of the whole weekend. So Hannah Sell.
Well, comrades, the main rally of socialism, which took place last night, was not quite the biggest socialism rally that we've ever held. But I honestly think it was the most enthusiastic, which is reflected in the appeal that Paula has just reported on. And why is it that there is such enthusiasm at Socialism 2018 this weekend? Probably in part, it's because it's such a relief to escape the fog of Brexit, where the news, the capitalist politicians, it's endless bickering between different wings of the Tory parties for their idea of how best to carry out Brexit. So to get away from that and to come to a meeting of working class fighters and young people who have a clear idea of how to overthrow this capitalist system is certainly a relief. And it is a system which is long overdue for removal. Just around the corner from here, there is a luxury tower block called Centrepoint. 44 years ago, homelessness campaigners occupied that tower block to protest against homelessness. Today, it's been refurbished and the flats are on the market for anywhere from £2 million to £55 million. They are mostly sitting empty, and underneath and surrounding Centrepoint are more homeless people sleeping on the streets than we have had for far longer than 44 years, for many, many decades here in Britain. By the way, not a few of them are former soldiers who were sent to fight for this country and have now been abandoned on their return home. Britain, one of the richest countries on the planet, has a UN poverty envoy here at the moment who is touring the country finding out about the misery being created by universal credit, who is interviewing people in Glasgow and Newcastle who have not eaten for days, who have a little bit of food but are terrified of eating it because they don't know where the next mouthful is going to come from. But I think actually the reports from that poverty envoy are not most important because they describe the misery which we all know about that exists up and down this country, but because they also describe the coming revolt that is going to take place against that misery. He asked children in a primary school in Glasgow, where should the money come from to overcome poverty? And a little boy put up his hand and said it should come from the rich. How can we have... can we have billionaires at the same time as the rest of us are living on benefits? The envoy interviewed a woman in Newcastle feeding a family of 3 adults on £500 a month. And she said, this can't go on. People are going to start smashing the windows and taking what they want. And she didn't mean iPods. She didn't mean luxury goods. She meant people would smash the windows of the supermarkets to take the basic necessities of life, a return to the food riots of the 1930s. Our role is not to create anger. There is enormous anger in this society, and there will be explosions as a result of it. Our role is to help give that anger organised form so that we can build a movement capable of transforming society. And we do that with a clear socialist programme that unites the different layers of the working class, of young people, sections of the middle class who are increasingly impoverished. Because it's inevitable that the tiny capitalist elite that rule try to divide us between those that claim benefits and those that manage to scrape by without, between young and old, between men and women. But whenever a lead is given, working class people understand we're the majority in this society. We're the people who create the profit, the people who keep society running, and when we are united, we have enormous power. Look at the fantastic Glasgow strike, in which our sister party in Scotland has played a leading role. The thousands of women who have struck for equal pay and have put picket lines on the bin depots on mainly male workers, and those workers have refused to cross, have broken the anti-trade union laws and come out in solidarity with those women for equal pay. But despite that heroic strike and the many other heroic strikes that are taking place in different parts of Britain, the railway workers fighting to keep our trains safe and guards on the train, the young, mainly young workers in TFI Fridays and McDonald's who are out on strike. But despite those important strikes, it's probably true to say that at the moment the mood in Britain is more one of sullen frustration and anger rather than of mass struggle. But as other speakers have explained throughout the weekend, there is nothing preordained or automatic in that. We would have seen massive struggles this year, engulfing society, had the trade union leaders and the Labour leadership been prepared to give a consistent lead. May really is hanging by a thread. Dominic Raab is clearly not the brightest knife in the box. So he blurted it out. He actually said to the newspapers, Theresa May is hanging by a thread. And then he said, but it's quite a thick one in a desperate attempt. It takes one to know one, as somebody has heckled down the bottom there. I didn't quite dare make that joke. I'm not very good at jokes. Anyway, so this government could go at any time, but it can also still cling on. And we can't wait. We need a movement to force the Tories out of office. And that would be potentially a huge step forward. As Dave has explained, we campaigned for a Jeremy Corbyn-led government with a socialist programme in the general election last year. And we would like the chance to do so again as soon as possible. But we are frustrated, as millions of people are frustrated, by the continued attempts to work together with and to unify with the Blairite backstabbers who are determined to prevent a Jeremy Corbyn-led government coming to power. Let's be clear. Many of them marched on the People's Vote demonstration. People like Chuka Umunna marched arm in arm with the Tory Anna Soubry, saying that he stood for a people's vote. But a real people's vote, the people's vote that we want, a general election, he will do anything he can, along with the other Blairites, to prevent. Because the one thing that worries the capitalist elite more than the Tory Brexit mess is the threat of a Jeremy Corbyn-led government coming to power. And that is not because of his actually relatively moderate policies. It's because of the upsurge of hope that would come from below and the demands that would come from millions, like that little boy in Glasgow, saying we want a decent life and take the money from the rich in order to provide it. So they're desperate to prevent Corbyn coming to power. And that could even mean, for all their posing about a people's vote, that a section of the Blairites could vote for May's Tory Brexit deal if she can cobble something together which the capitalist class think that they can live with in order to try and prevent a general election taking place. And that will make it clear, even more than it already is, in the minds of millions of people, they are not part of the Labour Party. They don't stand for the many, they stand for the few. And they should immediately have the whip withdrawn from them and be removed as Labour MPs in that situation. Paul has described how, as socialists, when we have elected representatives in Parliament, then we use them to fight to strengthen the workers' movement and workers' struggle. We are not parliamentary cretins, as Juan Ignacio put it last night. And as Sharma described, we understand that as soon as you get elected, you're told play by the rules of the game, accept the system, be reasonable, be nice. And once you accept that idea, then you are stepping back and from defending the interests of the working class and taking the road, ultimately, of betraying the interests of the working class. And we think it is a serious mistake by John McDonnell and other left leaders of the Labour Party to think that it's possible to convince the banksters, the financiers, the CBI to be nice. It doesn't matter how much tea you drink with them, those people are never going to be nice. All they are interested in doing is defending their own profits, their own system, and driving the living conditions of the working class into the ground. And therefore, the only way that they can be defeated, that the policies of a left Corbyn-led government could be implemented, is by mobilising a mass movement of the working class and linking that to a socialist programme that would take wealth and power out of the tiny elite, the small number of big corporations that currently control it, in order to begin to build a new democratic socialist society where, unlike capitalism today, the bare necessities of life will be something that you just had, that were accepted as a given. Enough to eat, a decent house, a decent job, the right to retire, free education. They would be a given as we began to build a new socialist society, where saving the environment and the planet would be what mattered instead of the profits of a few. That's the society that we're fighting for. But we don't just talk about it in halls like this. We take part in every struggle to improve the living conditions of working class people today, at the same time as linking that to the need for the socialist transformation of society. Dave today has made very important points about the role that we have played as part of the trade unionist and socialist coalition Tusk, alongside worker militants, independent socialists, and also the Transport Workers' Union, 80,000 strong, standing candidates against austerity. And as he has explained, Tusk supporters in the RMT, along with others, have successfully won the argument at their conference this year that now is not the time to affiliate to the Labour Party with its still undemocratic structure, that they can better support Corbyn and anti-austerity policies by remaining independent, and they remain part of Tusk. But the Tusk supporters in the RMT at this stage have not been able to convince the executive of the union to go ahead and stand candidates in next year's election. But in our view, it is absolutely essential that we do that. Dave has explained. Peter said last night, our slogan is it's better to break the law than to break the poor. But Labour councils don't even have to break the law right now. They can set anti-cuts budgets using their borrowing powers and their reserves, and John McDonnell can promise to pay it all back the minute that a Labour government is elected. Imagine if even a handful of Labour councils was to do that, was to stop closing women's refuges but to open them instead, was to build council houses, to provide a grant for 16 to 18-year-olds, to reopen the libraries. It would electrify the country. We've talked about Liverpool and what we did in Liverpool and the real gains for working class people, 5,000 council houses built and so on. Well, there was an article in the New Statesman just a few weeks ago, and the New Statesman are not particularly friendly to the Socialist Party, and the author of the article was not particularly friendly to the Socialist Party. But in it he said, has there ever been another occasion apart from Liverpool when 50,000 people marched in support of their local council? When local election turnouts previously pitiful soared, Labour's vote grew by 70% in 2 years as a result of what Liverpool City Council did. Imagine today, when the cuts are much worse than they were in the 1980s, when instead of a Labour leader who was determined to stab us in the back and the front in Neil Kinnock, we have a left Labour leadership. And imagine the hundreds of thousands that would march if a few Labour councils were prepared to stand up and fight. And yet, unfortunately, even the self-declared Corbynite council in Haringey, who have been elected correctly saying they would get rid of the gentrification project, handing over housing to a private corporation, but are now discussing, in order to balance the books, carrying out another 10% cuts on top of the 40% cuts that that council has already suffered. That is not a strategy to fight austerity. That raises the real danger that people begin to say, is this Labour Party against austerity? Because we're seeing it continued to be implemented at local level. And it's why we think it's essential. Tusk and the Socialist Party have been the only ones to advance a strategy to fight austerity at local level in the council chamber. And we have to continue to put that forward. It's more important than ever to encourage trade unionists, workers, community campaigners to stand themselves, but also for us to stand a socialist alternative against at least the worst of the Blairite cutters. Just to explain, we would rather stand as the Socialist Party, but the undemocratic Electoral Commission has never let us register the name Socialist Party. Hence, we're not having a name change, but that's why this different logo is up here today, that we will be standing under the banner of Socialist Alternative. But that is the party's banner, and one advantage of it, we'd rather be standing as part of Tusk, but one advantage is we can link it directly for the need to everybody who supports what we're saying to join the Socialist Party as part of those local election campaigns. And that is the very final point I want to make. Some of you are veterans of the Socialist Party, but there are also a lot of people here who are at your first meeting. And you've heard about the work that Socialist Party activists are involved in. Wherever there's struggle taking place, whether it's to save the local hospital, to fight for free education, on the picket lines, fighting for women's rights against racism, the Socialist Party is there, fighting day to day and linking it for the need for socialism. We're part of the Committee for Workers International, and you've heard just a little bit about the magnificent struggles that the CWI is involved in around the world. And if you agree, you should join us. Actually, if you agree, you must join us. Because on your own, you can't change anything. This is a very basic point, but if you decide to go on strike tomorrow and you just stay in bed on your own, you'll get the sack. To fight back, you've got to organise collectively. And if you agree with what we're saying about socialism, about the need to change the world, then you need to do it as part of an organisation. To join with us in a mighty struggle at which we are at only the very beginning. Because what we are doing is working to build a mass party of the working class that is capable of leading a struggle to overthrow capitalism and introduce a new democratic socialist order. If that's what you want, then join with us in the Socialist Party and in that struggle.